heard about Killers of the Flower Moon, and then how it was interrupted. The plans were interrupted by a little global pandemic, during which things changed a lot, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that little thing. I had gone in to meet with Ellen Lewis for the first time October 2019. And then, there was a really sweet, like, kind of explaining how the casting process was going to work. So if I heard anything, don't let any little thing discourage me. She said, we're doing a locals casting first. And I'm like, good, because that's how I got my first job. And she qualified it a lot, because it felt like there was like this big wink there. Then when I got the sides in, I remember just kind of struggling with him as an actor. And I don't know, this is my last Guild screening of the season, so thank you all for being here.
Yes.
Thank you.
So those of you in SAG out there probably are well familiar with the feeling of having a long expositional monologue and being like, oh, how do I show who this person is? And especially somebody like Molly, the woman that you just spent the last 3.5 hours with on screen. I can't really imagine her with these big, long monologues. And I just remember feeling particularly like reading it. I'm like, I don't think these are dummy sides. They're a little too well developed. You get in one speech, all of her sisters laid out in one go. You get, you hear about the Henry Roan murder. You get, Ernest kind of, maybe she's feeling some weird suspicion, and then he does something charming, and she's like, okay, let's go right around, we're fine. So it was later in Q&As on this circuit, Marty confirmed that in that version of the script that I'd auditioned on initially, that was one of 3 scenes that Molly had in the whole film. So I just remember when the pandemic shut everything down, I knew that the project had been put on hold. I'd seen some stuff in the press about that, and there was a part of me that felt like maybe it had just, lost its momentum, or there wasn't like inspiration. I'd heard like, some industry chatter. I know that people just kind of like talk about stuff at like bars, and then it ends up on Twitter and everybody takes it for truth. But just something about how like, yeah, Marty's not inspired by this one, so he's moving on to do like his next thing. So I was kind of like, I was finishing an independent film, very remotely at the time, and was kind of thinking, all right, maybe our industry is not going to pick up again for a while. Clearly, Killers of the Flower Moon is not happening. I didn't feel good about my audition. Just assumed it hadn't gone my way. So I was getting ready to do something else with my life for a period of time, and then came back around. And when I got this request to Zoom with Marty, like I was like, wow, that's kind of bypassed a callback. Okay. There were new sides attached, and it was the scene for about 95% as it was written on the page is how it shows up on the screen, where Ernest and Molly are having dinner for the first time. And I was like, oh, there's layers here, there's beats. I can infuse like 3 different meanings with this one line. This is great. This is a scene. And then suddenly it was something I could play. It was something that felt very thrilling, and it definitely felt like it was one of many. It's like, all right, there's 3 pages being given to one scene between these 2 characters instead of 3 pages being given, and you get pretty much the whole plot of Molly and Ernest in those 3 pages I'd first auditioned on. So it was kind of tremendous. And it also was indicative to me that where I felt like the story would be most successful, having read the book, having read Grant's Killers of the Flower Moon, the way you're so drawn to Molly in the book, it's, historically the story has been told, but it's always centered the FBI, the formation of the FBI portion of it. For, decades, people have felt like that's what's most significant about these murders. Not that it was a systemic erasure of the wealthiest people per capita at that time in the world, a non-white community, not this large indictment and very ridiculously tragic history that we don't know about. It takes It takes investigative journalists who are great writers who like write a book that captures public attention. It doesn't just show up in our curriculums. So I thought in that first meeting with Marty, and then the meeting after the meeting with Marty was Marty and Leo, another Zoom meeting. That meeting, the whole time, I was anticipating that me and Leo were gonna read this scene together, but we never did. We spent the whole time just talking about everything. But I think the centerpiece of that meeting was and I think what kind of maybe cinched it for Marty at that point was just asking my opinion about shifting the narrative away from the FBI story and then putting Ernest and Molly's relationship at the center and what I thought about that. And I had drawn the comparison immediately to Graham Greene's The Quiet American, both the novel and the film. And it's like, I didn't walk into that film wanting a detailed explanation of, of the Vietnam War, of all of the different battles, of all of the different times when U.S. starts sending troops over, what's going on politically. I don't want to watch a narrative that's just a history lesson. I learned so much and contextualized because it was not the era I was born in, but it definitely shaped my parents' lives. So watching this love story, this love triangle between, what represents these two colonizing forces over a Vietnamese woman and the way that she stood in for that entire conflict, the real people that were affected by it, and the way that this possessive, competitive love story between these two white men around their love for her really that's what was going on. Those were the imperial forces and power play. So we talked about that, and I said, this is a good example of that, because this is the colonizing forces in the Americas and colonizing forces worldwide. In those first early relationships with indigenous people, if it's not just brutal slaughter, it's establishing of treaties, it's establishing of trust. We enter into these nation-to-nation relationships in a trust way. I mean, it's literally like native lands in the United States are held in trust by the U.S. government. And that trust has been continually betrayed. Our inherent sovereignty as native nations has been eroded and eroded and eroded over the years to where we've become completely dependent. Politically anyways, on paper anyways, we are considered wards of the US government. It was a specific program for the Osage in the Reign of Terror, or that drove the Reign of Terror, this guardianship program, where Osages needed to have a white person in charge of their finances. The idea of Native people in America being incompetent of handling their finances was widespread, though. If you were resource rich, Osage had the guardianship program. Most of the rest of us, if we had money from leasing our lands to surface grazing, to any mineral extraction, those checks would be forwarded to the United States Treasury with no forwarding address. So for decades, billions of dollars accumulated in the U.S. Treasury. That was Indian money. It was our money from leasing out our lands. It's, that pot of money was used to bail out the Chrysler Corporation in the 70s because the Treasury didn't know what else to do with it. So, it just felt like this love story was a beautiful analogy to have that conversation about this ongoing legacy of exploitation and betrayed trust.
Molly.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
First meeting with Marty and Leo was kind of describing my great-grandmother Lily and the presence that she holds in my home. I never met her either, but she passed away in 1980, so my family remembers her. My father's the oldest boy in the family, and he was very close to her, because it's kind of built into tradition that the oldest grandkid lives with and takes care of the grandparents. And Dad was never in house with Grandma Lily, but he was the one who drove her around and took her everywhere, so they got really close. And so I was raised hearing stories about this traditional Blackfoot woman who lived through this period of time. She was born in 1896. Molly was born in 1886. So in the same time frame, they witnessed the same changes. This encroachment of modernity and the way that just becomes integrated to tradition, the way that it's articulated through our traditions. And Grandma Lily also was devoutly Catholic, like Molly, and like Molly's family still is. So I had kind of that basis of understanding. And Grandma Lily was also married to, even though he was native, he was very much a cowboy, and had that sort of personality that a perceived Ernest might have. So I understood what that dynamic and that attraction would have been anyway. Grandma Lily had a lot of stories about Grandpa Alec, and one of the ones that stood out, and for a minute Marty thought about putting it in the script, was when Alec would come home and from like gambling and being a little too drunk, all of the kids, Lily, my grandma, great grandma, and all of her kids would roll tires out and cover him with tires so that he would not freeze in the night, but also if he woke up, he couldn't fight his way out. He'd have to sober up. So I talked about how families built around that personality type. There's an acceptance of this kind of trickster spirit that these men bring into your life, and like you share children with, and they're not perfect, but you work your way around it, and it's. So I saw some elements there, but I didn't want to just run with the Grandma Lily influence. When I got to Osage Country, I was like, okay, I want to approach Molly the way I would expect another actress to approach my grandma. So how would I want that actress to approach my family and my community? And, it was not asking invasive, prying questions, because that feels like picking at an open wound for a community that's still processing this trauma, that's still living next door to the descendants of some of the perpetrators of these traumas. Like this community, it's active. It's even though the reign of terror basically ended and like these murders basically stopped when the guardianship program was dissolved, there's a big legacy of that. And there's a lot of ongoing implications from that history. But in any case, I wanted to go in and just offer those stories about my Grandma Lily and see if that would resonate. If I didn't want to make an Osage woman too Blackfoot. So I would just listen and hear. When I would share family stories, then I would hear family stories. And then when you hear these family stories, I'd ask permission. It's like, that's really beautiful. Is it okay if I introduce you to Marty, or if I share that story with Marty? And, pretty overwhelmingly it was yes. The end of that first dinner scene, it had in the script ended with Molly and Ernest drinking whiskey together. And Molly basically drinking Ernest under the table, which was funny, and I appreciated it. A lot of the community said that wasn't Molly. That wasn't her personality. She would probably sip it. She would have it in the home. It was like a fine thing to have, a fine thing to share. But as far as like polishing off a whole bottle with a white man, that wouldn't have been Molly. That very much could have been Anna. But Molly Burkhart's remembered as being kind of the sister in her family that of all of them, partly because she's the second born. There's an Osage birth order that really influences your personality. The firstborn daughter, the word for them is Mina. Mina has the right to wear red. So Anna in this family is Mina. The world revolves around her. She can do no wrong. She can do whatever she wants. All the light shines on her. She's mom's first baby. And, you can see that the way that Lizzie wants Anna. There's that element of the birth order, but also because Anna's personality was brought up and fostered to be very big and unapologetic about who she was living in a very dangerous time to be an oldest daughter, to have that personality. So of course mom is a little bit more worried about her, where Molly's responsibility is the second born, is to take care of her mom, take care of her family, to be more grounded, to be more humble, to be more dutiful. So that was that scene ended up changing to reflect that element of Molly, to reflect the way the community spoke about this second-born girl and her responsibilities. It came out of a story from a man named Wilson Pipestem, who's become a very dear friend. He's Osage. He does a lot of work in the community. He's a lawyer. But he talked about his grandma Rose Pipestem. When a storm would blow through, she would put her blanket on, she would sit with her palms upturned and just receive it. Everything would stop and get very quiet. And Marty saw that when Wilson shared that story with me and then shared that story with Marty. Marty suddenly had a way to end that scene. And it was a really beautiful way of drawing whatever that, maybe the basis of the chemistry that Ernest and Molly would have had. It's like the two different paces they work at. And I love that my first viewing of it, you get to sit through the credits hearing that storm, like adopting that story that came from this family of how, you know, Grandma Rose would just sit and let this blow over. You know, storms, Molly doesn't articulate to Ernest. She's not expository with it because it's culture. You know, you can't like, oh, what does that mean? It's like, it means A, B, C, D, E. It's like, it's not really how it works. It's like, it's powerful, you know, whatever meaning that you want to derive from it. But one thing Wilson did say was like storms at that time of this transition, you know, Osage still very much, it was plausible that people would be dying of these mysterious wasting illnesses. Because you're coming out of a period of time where people were still operating with what Osages now like talk about as the old religion. But people have power. People can summon storms and send them places to reign over like people they don't like. So if you're sitting through a storm, you just have to be very mindful and very reverent of it, because you don't know if it's been sent by somebody who has ill intent for you. So that was also kind of an underlying theme of that particular I want to say episode scene. That scene in the story is there's a storm coming and Molly doesn't know that it's sitting right next to her.
Right.
Wow.